Good morning. It's Linda Jones here. I think most of you who signed in have probably read the blurb, but I'm an international consultant in inclusive market systems development with expertise in women's economic empowerment. And it's really great to welcome you all here today. I'm calling in from Canada, so it's early morning here, and I'm at the Hockley Valley Retreat with another client who has not started work yet this morning. I'll be joined by Nurul Siddiquee from CARE's global program, and he's calling in, which is the afternoon for him, from Dhaka and Bangladesh paper. This webinar parallels a paper which is what I'm calling the update of the M4P WE framework to a women's empowerment and market systems framework, a WEAMS framework. And as we go through this presentation this morning, you'll see why that name got changed. And so I've prepared a paper which is a new framework essentially. And in that paper, I discuss the paradigm shift, I discuss conceptual changes and practical guidance, and this is the contents of this webinar as well, and I'll walk through each of those now. So first of all, why did I think the time had come to put the effort into updating the M4P WE framework? And there's a number of reasons. One is there's been a huge expansion of a market systems approach globally, through different donors and agencies and so on. And all this interest has led to a kind of more general approach, not pure, what some would call pure M4P, even though most of market systems is based on M4P thinking. So that's one reason. Another is there's just this wealth of emerging global experience in market systems programming and women's empowerment. And I've named a few organizations there, the ones that I'm most familiar with. ALCP or Alliances in Georgia, Financial Sector Deepening in Zambia, Catalyst and M4C in Bangladesh, Kenya Market Trust in Nairobi, the Market Development Facility in South Asia, on the Pacific, Prism Indonesia, MEDA in West Africa and elsewhere, as well as MENA and AWEF. And actually, I can hear somebody typing and my poll window hasn't closed. I don't know if somebody at Beam can change what I'm seeing in the right hand there, or if there's a mic that someone has open. Anyway, in addition to the wealth of emerging global experience for market systems and women's empowerment, there's also been a lot of development in other parallel fields. So the UN roadmap, IFPRI and USAID's Women's Empowerment and Agricultural Index and the learning and case studies around that, the International Center for Research on Women, and so on and so on and so on. And I think there's a lot of good learnings we can draw from those other approaches and frameworks. And then finally, the donor expectations have changed. Whereas in the past, we could sometimes get away with saying, well, we tried to integrate women and do gender, but it didn't work, and kind of ticky box. Now the expectation is there that, no, you will figure it out and you will report on it. And that's the expectation. And in some cases, it's written into the legislation about around aid in those donor countries. So those are some of the reasons for the updated WEAMS framework. The paradigm shift for WEAMS, we're not going to go into this in too much detail, but other than to say in some organizations it's still difficult to take on women's economic empowerment. And there are a number of reasons that are given for this. And in the paper I talk about why those reasons to me are no longer valid. And I kind of refer to them as myths, but maybe that's a little bit negative. I think we all went through phases where we thought, well, that's too difficult, or we can't do it for this reason. But now we have so much learning, so many tools, so much support, that I don't think there's really any excuses anymore for organizations not to be gender inclusive and to mainstream women in their programming. However, our next slide is another poll, so I think it would be great if you can say, do you think there are reasons that we can't integrate women's economic empowerment into market systems? So if you think yes, there are still reasons, there are missed arguments, please choose yes. If you think no, there's no excuse anymore, has to be full steam ahead, select no. And if you think, well, you're kind of, yeah, sometimes I think it's valid, but not in all cases. And then you can even enter that information into the chat box. So I'm going to let you take some time now to respond to those questions. And when I realized that the way the question's asked, it's a bit misleading, so I'm going to repeat that. If you think there are reasons that we still cannot integrate women or do gender in a market systems approach, then pick yes. If you think that there is no reason not to, so sorry, that's a bit convoluted, then pick no. If you think, well, in some cases it's still valid, then pick in some cases. And so the poll's completed now, and we'll just wait for a few seconds for the results to come up, and we'll see where you all stand on this. And then, yeah, so that's just going to take a few more seconds, I believe. Okay, so do you think there are missed arguments? One person does, so it'd be great for you to enter that into a chat. 27 people think there's no reason anymore, the way is clear. You have some people think, yeah, there could be some cases, so again, great if you can enter that into the chat. And then about half of the participants did not answer, so that's okay. Moving forward here. So in addition to the two topics I've already touched on, the two remaining topics that are in the updated framework and in this webinar are conceptual updates to the framework and then practical guidance. So with regard to conceptual updates, I've kind of bundled them in three areas. So the first area is fitting into the broader dialogue. And by this, I mean, as I mentioned, there's other parallel approaches and frameworks, but then there's some broader dialogue. For example, what is gender equality and what is women's economic empowerment and what are we doing in market systems? So in market systems, we're really focused on women's economic empowerment because we can contribute to gender equality, but we don't create gender equality, because gender equality means the end result when men and women have equal access, equal agency, etc. So through our programming, women's empowerment or women's economic empowerment, we're contributing to realizing the ultimate goal of gender equality. Another concept really from the broader dialogue is gender mainstreaming. And I like to draw on the SDC approach to gender mainstreaming, which includes integration, full integration, targeting, and dialogue. And there are three different elements, and I explained that in the paper. I won't go into it now. I think a lot of you are aware of that, and we have a very limited time today. Then a second conceptual area, which I will go into a bit more today, are about what I call the 5 non-negotiables of women's economic empowerment in market systems. But these non-negotiables can be customized, and they can be reorganized, and they can be added onto. And then I'll also talk about innovations in measurement, because I think there's some really interesting things that are emerging there, and in particular, I'll be providing some examples and also include the examples from Catalyst and from the market development facility there. So I'll go into this now, and then at the end I'll talk a bit about practical guidance. So for those of you who are familiar with the original M4PWE framework, there were actually in the paper there were 4 dimensions, and I was strongly advising a 5th, and shortly thereafter the 5th was adopted by a number of donors, in particular SDC. So that really, in the early days, became the 5th non-negotiable dimension. So economic advancement, meaning increased income, increased profit, increased return on labor. The second is access to life chances and opportunities, such as jobs, an opportunity to start a business, opportunity to become educated. The third is access to assets, services, and support functions, so all those things that need to wrap around when women are taking advantage of the opportunities. The 4th and 5th are agency dimensions, so decision-making authority, including but not limited to household finances, and finally, manageable workloads. And I call these non-negotiables. I've thought a lot about this. I've thought about changing them over the years. I've worked with a lot of different programs since the first paper was published back in early 2012. And I really think if you're doing if you're doing a program where you're trying to economically empower women and one of these is missing, I think there's going to be issues around the empowerment of that woman. If she's not gaining access to things she needs, if she's not earning more income or getting a better return on her labor, if she's not controlling if she's not empowered to make decisions or control her money, and if her workload has become unmanageable and she cannot make that decision or control it, then I think there's an issue. So that's why I call those the non-negotiables. But I also think there's a lot of other dimensions that can be added on, and programs should absolutely be innovative and imaginative and feel very free to do that if they're following this framework. And I think these other dimensions was very context specific. For example, in some countries, women's mobility can be a big issue. In other, it's access to very specific assets. But then it can be things around social norms as well, which we're seeing more and more of that now, which is really exciting and interesting. For example, Oxfam has done a lot of work on gender-based violence and how that interconnects with women's economic empowerment. DFID has a framework around voice, choice, and control. USAID and IFPRI and the Women's Empowerment and Agricultural Index also focus on leadership. And I think many of these do come out in market systems programs and can be added into your own program, what you're trying to achieve for women's economic empowerment. Now, just to give you an example from Alliances Georgia, or ALCP, you can also customize the non-negotiables. You don't just have to state it the way they're stated in the framework. And ALCP has recently written a paper, which I believe will be published soon, and I'm quoting here. And it states that for them, when they're trying to assess whether or not they've achieved women's economic empowerment, indicators will be improved by using indicators that are within the scope and experience of the program remit, as they will be easier to attribute to the program. So that's a really good way of framing it. And then when you look at the indicators, they do follow the 5 non-negotiables, and were probably developed independently because Alliances has been thinking about this for a long time before the framework paper was published. But you see the dimensions they have are the same, and I think it's interesting because I also noticed that USAID's dimensions and other dimensions, they're often very much the same. And I don't think it's because necessarily people are copying each other. I think people have reflected deeply on it, and I think the non-negotiables are things that people have come to realize independently are non-negotiables. So the way Alliances Georgia frames it are access to services, markets, access to time saved, and access to public goods, and then agency over household budgeting and expenditure related to livestock, and there they've emphasized the specific subsector in which they're working, which I think is completely valid, agency over time saved, and agency over public decision making. So they've customized the non-negotiables and added to it. So moving forward, so that was about, those last 2 slides were about the non-negotiables. Now I'm going to talk a little bit about conceptually how some of the innovations in measurement, and again, just briefly touching on that in this presentation, much more detail in the paper. And this comes from the Market Development Facility, which is funded by DFAT, or the Australian government, and is being implemented in Fiji, Timor-Leste, Pakistan, Papua New Guinea, and Sri Lanka. And MDF has developed a gender framework for their programming. It's an excellent document. I would recommend everybody read it who's working in this field and has an interest. It's very detailed, lots of great examples. But what they've also done in that paper is they've looked at levels of systemic change. And I think, as most of you are aware, when we look at systemic change in market systems programming, we're looking at change at the level of the market actor and then the impact of that on the ultimate beneficiary or program participant. And now, so MDF has actually mapped this out at different stages and how that affects women's economic empowerment. And so the initial stage, partners are innovating their practice to provide women with access to services, jobs, and other benefits. at the intermediate stage, if we look at the bottom point there, and I think this is the beginning of the systemic change. More women are able to access these services, jobs, and other benefits without MDF intervention. So we're not talking about change at the market actor level. That is covered here. But now we're looking specifically at the systemic change for women. Then when we look at the advanced stage, again, there are the systemic changes. But if we look at the bottom point, there are signs that women have increased decision-making power and influence as a result of their improved access. So market development facility is very much looking at, you have a partner, they change their behavior, women have improved access, and along with that, women gain improved agency. Sometimes there can actually be agency interventions, but we won't go into that now. Then when you look at the mature level, or the mature stage for women's economic empowerment through their market systems programming, very quickly read all four, increasingly more women gain sustained access to the services, jobs, and other benefits, so not just the targets of the program. Women realize a sustained increased benefit as a result of their access, ongoing after the project ends. Other businesses see a vested interest in targeting women, and they act on this. So this is the whole crowding in, but it's crowding in vis-a-vis engaging women and therefore impacting women's empowerment. And finally, there are broader signs of increasing empowerment, particularly in areas of agency. So I think this is a really fabulous preliminary work on this, and I think probably some of you are already building on this, so that'll be interesting to learn more about. And the second innovation in measurement that I think is also really fascinating is work that Catalyst has done. They've developed an index which benchmarks, which they benchmark to assess how their projects have achieved women's economic empowerment. So it can score and rank their different interventions across different subsectors in which they're intervening, or it can be within a subsector, across subsectors, or even their whole program, depending on how the results are consolidated. And it does involve statistical analysis. We worked with a statistician who's worked on assessing impact of investments, so very knowledgeable about that. And he was not only able to assist us in running a pilot of the index, tabulating the results, and finding out where Catalyst had impact, but he was able to validate the index by running regression and chi, and I don't know what those things are, but they have been explained to me, and run it against a treatment group and a control group. And it was really interesting because Catalyst is at the early stages of these interventions, and what the index showed was that women who are targeted by the intervention are reporting greater access to skills development, and that was tested against the control group, so that definitely is proven as a result of the project. The other thing which I find is also fascinating is that women were in the early days already reporting increased decision-making power around the productive activity. And that makes a lot of sense, and when you think about it, it's very logical. So, okay, women initially, as their decision-making grows, the decision-making grows around the productive activity in which they're gaining greater experience and knowledge. And Olaf Weber, the statistician that we worked with, who's done a lot of impact work, says that's typically what he's seen, that as decision-making power, as it begins to grow, it grows where women have gained new skills and authority, but then that does begin to carry over into other aspects of their life. And so, for example, in Catalyst, when they introduced the contract farming model, and women who became contract farmers, they began to make their own decisions, but it began to be recognized in their communities or in their families that they're actually now skilled in that area, they have knowledge, they have information, others are coming to them, so their status in their household would grow, but also in the whole community, and they're seen as leaders, so other dimensions are being affected by this as well. So the index was able to test that and reinforce it, which I think is absolutely fascinating for the industry, and I'm hoping that Catalyst will be publishing something on this in the near future. The final part of the new WEAMS framework is practical guidance. And, this was touched on in the original M4PW framework, but I've put a lot of effort into really capturing the learning of the many programs around the world that have practical guidance to offer, as well as other tools that are out there. So there will be practical guidance following the project lifecycle, which I'll talk briefly about in a minute. But first, some of you may be aware, after the M4PW framework document was published, COFFEE did an analysis and worked with programs who were doing market systems development and against the WE framework, and whether or not how the program stacked up and whether or not the WE framework was valid for those programs. And in most cases, most of it did appear to be valid. But COFFEE also then developed a list of challenges and opportunities around women's economic empowerment, which I think really stand the test of time. So I discussed that in the framework and then add some other learning and some mini cases as well. But then, as I was saying, I really like the project lifecycle approach, because what we do at each stage is different, whether that's for women's economic empowerment or for any other aspect of the program. And what I'm using in the document is the project lifecycle that M4P uses, and this is taken from the diagram is not, but the 5 stages are taken from their new operational guidance. So first the project strategy, then the diagnosis, then the vision, intervention, and measurement. But what I've done differently, I think, for women's economic empowerment, I've put the project strategy in the middle. It's not something that we typically revisit, or we hope we're not having to revisit it in our programs, and yet it informs each step of whether we're doing the diagnosis or research and analysis, where we're have our vision for change and we're designing our interventions, whether we're actually implementing our interventions, working with partners, or whether we're measuring. We need to know what is our starting point for that, and it is our project strategy. So it keeps us focused. It's like it provides our direction for our work. And so before I pass it over to Siddiquee, I have a couple of examples of how the project lifecycle can also be customized. And again, I would stress that any work you do in women's economic empowerment has to fit your context. It also has to fit your program, and your program lifecycle might look different than the M4P one. And so this is the program lifecycle that Prism Indonesia, and I should mention that's a program being implemented by Palladium and funded also by the Australian government, or DFAT. And then another project lifecycle which looks quite different. Okay, this is from the Kenya Market Trust in Kenya, and their project lifecycle, it matches how their program is working. And you can see, yeah, it's quite different because they bundled things differently, but it's what works for their program and makes sense for the rest of their program. So I think even before you do the project lifecycle for WE, if you haven't done one for your project, I think you should. And one of the important reasons why it's good to harmonize the two is at each step of the program, each step of the project lifecycle, you actually often have documents that you're producing. And this gives you guidance on what are the documents you also need to make sure are appropriately gendered. And again, that's covered in much more detail in the framework document. So I have a final question for you before I turn it over to Siddiquee. So I would really like your opinion on this, and you can start filling in your responses, but I'll just kind of read it out as well. So in your experience with the practical guidance that's available, where do you feel that you need more practical guidance, or where there's a gap? Is it on how to integrate women and gender into the overall program or the sector vision? Is it really thinking about the big picture on women's economic empowerment? Do you need more support for conducting your research and analysis even before you get to design, so inclusive research and analysis? Or do you think maybe you need more support in your strategic approaches for designing your interventions and planning your interventions? Is there enough information on there about how to go about your design and your plan? And that would include taking your partner into account, which I think is often a really interesting question. Or is it in your tools and tips for day-to-day or better guidance? And I noticed that I think we've just about run out of time. And I will actually be giving a couple of examples on these before I turn it over to Siddiquee. But, you know, maybe there's a greater need for tools and tips for day-to-day implementation challenges, or maybe you need better guidance on M&E and learning and how do you integrate women's economic empowerment into that. So it looks like the biggest need is strategic approaches for design and planning, and that's really interesting, and that's definitely an area it's bumped up in this new framework, and there's a lot of really good experience from the different programs out there that I've mentioned, like MDF, Prisma, Catalyst, and ALCP, really some of the leaders. But 51 have no answer, so that's also interesting. Finally, the thing that the WEAMS framework includes is practical tools in the step-by-step guidance or in the project life cycle, and I have two here which I'm not going to delve into, but I'll take a few seconds each. The first, this is a tool from Kenya Market Trust, and it's a tool that we developed for understanding how they can motivate partners to work with women as suppliers, employees, and consumers. And so some of the questions they'll ask themselves before engaging with a partner are women a new market segment? Can it lead to greater profitability? Can they realize greater efficiencies by working with women, access higher volumes, so on and so on? And this, of course, can be expanded from your own experience. And the second tool that I'm putting up here is a tool that Prism Indonesia uses with their partners, and as they're out there doing research and assessment, they're actually, and they're very much focused on agricultural sectors in Indonesia, so they're looking at the different roles of men and women in those agricultural sectors. So it's just organized in a very convenient, easy to fill out way. So, so I think this is really, really useful. And so now I'm going to be passing it over to Siddiquee, but for the beam, I actually do not have that option anymore because my window to the right only shows the poll. So I'm seeing, oh, maybe I can do it here. Let me see, chat, Q&A, polling, okay, found it. Okay. Siddiquee, I'm going to mute now, and I'll turn it over to you.
Thanks, Linda. Good morning, good afternoon, and good evening from this part of the world. I'm Nurul Siddiquee, and I work as a technical advisor under CARE's Global Food and Nutrition Security team. After this excellent update from Linda from the WE framework to WEAMS framework, my job, I think, is to provide a little bit of operational perspective on some of the highlights that she did. For example, the need for a paradigm shift in organizational worldview, or the deep-rooted myths that she talked about that actually prevails among many of us, including the practitioners and staff and partners, and we work around the market system approaches. So I will try to provide a couple of examples that how at CARE we have learned around those myths and how we have tried to streamline the understanding around gender and behavior change for our project staff and impact communities. But before we go into that, let us have the last poll of the webinar. So we are asking if you have ever measured your colleagues' attitude to gender and related behaviors. It's a simple poll. It's yes if you did it before, and no if you didn't. But it would also be interesting to hear from some of you, like how they have worked out. I will then go ahead and share a survey, a similar survey that we did with some details, with some added indicators for our staff in one of our programs. So let's see how this turned out for us. In some places of the world, we like to participate in polls. It often feels like voting. A few more seconds. Okay, so the result shows that 38 out of 80 have said that we haven't really measured or this kind of attitude or gender-related behavior. Some of us did that, so that's very interesting and inspiring, and I'm looking forward to hear some of those. So let me share what we did in with some of our staff. We try to find answers on the same question across a set of intra-household gender behaviors from our program and partner staff in Mali. So, and from individual responses against those set of gender behaviors, which we can see mentioned in those graphs, we see the most and least practiced behaviors of our own staff in their real life, you know, with their spouses, with their household members, etc. And as you follow to the right side of the graph, it also illustrates the more sensitive culture issues and the most transformational behavior change that may require greater social support and behavioral change communications. For example, our willingness to be a role model of, you know, for gender and behavior change in public, or actually discussing financial issues with our spouses. So domestic, traditional, and cultural barriers do play a significant role in this empowerment process for us, and I believe the same for the communities. So what are some of those key strategies to address such behaviors? One very informative observation was this graph that also related to decision making, a bit of details from the previous one, which showed that although we are encouraging community members to discuss financial decisions together, our own staff are uncomfortable with these practices in their households. And we have been following them up for a number of months, and you'll see that in the middle, you know, graph, part of the graph, it's actually not improving, or in fact decreasing. And staff reflections around those follow-ups, whether discussing finances and income is a sensitive issue. It can create some problems with other household members, and we need to work on those. These are real-life experiences that, you know, our staff has has been kindly shared with us. So let's go back to this paradigm shift that Linda was talking about, and what essentially we need is to be the change we want to see. And the broader dialogue that she mentioned is probably this challenge in the workplace as well, where we have this illusion of change, or we anticipate that things will automatically happen when they won't. And this change has to start from within us before asking our impact group to change. And often we need to see that whether staff were messaging or not, but do they really understand, or do they really practice what they're preaching to the communities? And then this, issues of non-negotiables, that 5 non-negotiables and beyond those that Linda discussed, is also about challenging this, these challenges of monitoring social norms. While it is fairly straightforward to capture changes in uptake of agricultural practices, skills, income, we often face challenges when it comes to monitor and measure complex societal changes. We have anecdotal evidences often, we have staff observations, but often we have no systematic way to capture the scope or the nature of those changes, which in case are often positive and negative. And obviously the factors, those are contributing to them. So the innovations in the measurement is certainly one aspect to look at. What we just presented here is like a personal performance metrics or a tracker that essentially was drawn from a participatory performance tracker that CARE has developed and worked with thousands of farmer field and business schools to measure, their performances around agriculture productivity. But at the same time, the tool we developed to measure and follow up personal behaviors of our staff is similar to, you can compare them with any value chain groups as well, where a team of staff or the members decide on key behavior indicators on role of men and women. And often they meet monthly to self-assess and discuss their own behavior changes and challenges as well. And this sounds like often like, a group of farmers who would do around a farmer field day, for example, to talk about specific roles men and women play during the different stage of a seasonal cropping cycle, an agricultural cropping cycle, for example. So we have these challenges, but what are some of the practical steps that probably will help us to measure and incorporate these strategies in the design phase as well? So here I'm just talking a few things about our 6-country pathways program, where we work with more than 65,000 smallholder women around dozens of value chains in Asia, East and West Africa. We do have a theory of change if you follow the right, part of the slide. We do recognize the importance of changing intra-household power relations, which is the change lever 4, and the enabling environment, which is the change lever 5, which refers to challenging social norms and practices, in particular through engagement of ours and our partner staff with men, boys, and key actors of the community in the market, and of course the extension service structures, which are key area of work around agriculture and market systems. So one of the key objective of this process is not just to measure change, but also to transform staff capacity. Their qualitative skills, their understanding of intra-household relationships, and what gender behavior change looks like. So for this reason, we actually worked with our own program staff as data collectors. Rather than using survey or, let's say, key informant interview instruments, we use participatory tools such as drawing tools to engage the respondents in conversations about changes that they have been seeing. We focused on their understanding of empowerment, changes in men's behavior and practices, processes of decision making, and changes in community leaders' own practices and views as well. And how was this process transformative? So for staff, by engaging them in the process, it really transformed their view of gender relations and also of what is possible to achieve. It also showed them that social change is possible, which is difficult, but yes, it's possible. Gave them a sense of accomplishment as well. And it also helped really expand their aspirations and visions of what gender equality looks like, because they could look into before and after situations as well. And most of all, it really helps them to create a shared vision together with the community. And from the community perspective, I think it's really created that aha moments when participatory tools were discussed, decision-making trees and empowerment drawings enabled women to reflect critically about what empowerment means and to feel pride in changes that they have been making. And also, they actually decided that they wanted some of those changes themselves. So some of the reflections of these gender transformative monitoring tools that Linda also mentioned in the updated framework. So what we know that this very process of monitoring gender can promote change when staff and communities are equally engaged in this inquiry and critical reflections. Obviously, we have some of these challenges of inherent trade-offs of engaging staff in the process. It can raise questions about quality, objectivity, etc. But the benefits we gain from this engaging staff and communities are so huge, so that these tools and processes, the commitment that requires and the buy-in from the entire team and an appreciation of the value of these processes are really worthy. And finally, committing to these processes means an intensive investment in skills as well, in the reflective capacity, time and mentorship, and follow-up of the changes. From our experience, we really think that these investments are crucial components when we work around sustainable market systems and where we want to see a more gender transformative change as well. So I will stop here and will give the mic to Linda, but we'll really welcome all of you with your questions.
Yeah. Well, thank you, Siddiquee. That was a fantastic presentation. I mean, just to see the work that CARE is doing and how you're really pulling it right through the whole organization, and the paradigm shift. It's obviously not just simply responding to a few questions, but it's really a very deep process. So I think that's a really excellent exposure to that, how you're working with that, and the great work that CARE continues to do. Now, I just have a reminder for everybody who's on the line. You can enter your questions into the chat box, and I see there's a few there. We also received some questions in advance of the webinar, so I think I'll answer one or two now while people are entering. I'll maybe pick one that we've already received, and Siddiquee can also do the same. And then we'll also go through. We won't have time to answer them all, but we will. I think we'll have a chance to respond on the LinkedIn group. And also, somebody asked about documents. Those are any documents that have been not the unpublished ones, but they'll either be on the WEAMS webpage, or the ones related to this webinar will be, but also in the WEAMS framework when it's published. There'll be lots of references in there, so you'll have lots of documents and things that I've mentioned that you can refer to there. So I think just to get the questions going, I'm going to respond to a question that came in from DFAT, the Australian government. And the question is, market systems are showing promise as a sustainable approach to increasing women's incomes. Are you seeing any evidence that the approach is positively affecting gender norms, or is it too early to tell? And I think some of us would agree that the agency dimensions of decision-making and workload they're wrapped up often in the gender norms, but so is access. So I think there's a lot of evidence, and again, Market Development Facility, the framework for looking at systemic change for women shows some of that. But more recently, the BEAM Exchange has funded some research very specifically into social norms and how programs are dealing with that. And we're looking at the CARE program, we're looking at another program in Africa, as well as many cases, and that's going to be available soon. But I do think the work in social norms and how a lot of us work with and around social norms, and there has been a lot of gender awareness and gender sensitization. But I think a lot of us do feel we have to go much deeper, and I think it's early days on that work, but it is very exciting work, and more research is coming available on that. So Siddiquee, if you have you'd like to jump into your next question. Siddiquee. Yeah.
Yep, thanks, Linda. I have a question from Mercy Corps. our colleague is asking is it too naive to think that markets will see the benefits and respond to women's economic empowerment and gender-based violence issues, or there is a need for an extra push from the donor-funded agencies? And to me, I think both are true. And I also wanted to highlight a few sentences from the Gates Foundation website, responding to common grantee questions and concerns for gender differences. And one of them was interesting quote, like from a grantee, for example, is that changing culture and society is not our role. And the response to such quotes has been very explicit, and it was like, we acknowledge that all development projects will affect individuals, households, and communities. We hope for the better. When we ask grantees to address women's needs, we are simply asking that they apply smart design principles that support women, not undermine social norms or effect changes that are unsustainable or wanted by the community itself. And we acknowledge that a gender-responsive approach will be more important for some projects than the others. However, even research and development efforts will one day affect farmers. We ask that all grantees design a logical path to the ultimate user of a service or technology. In most cases, both women and men will be affected by your intervention, and we ask that you anticipate what those effects might be. So, yeah, I think I think many of our system players are really seeing the benefits in some cases, but there is that extra push as well from the donor-funded agencies as well. Linda?
Yeah. So I have a question here from Mercy Corps US, which was also sent in to us ahead of time. And I think after we each answer one more of these advanced questions, we'll go to the questions that have been asked today. Well, this one is, does domestic, traditional, and cultural barriers play a significant role in the empowerment process? And what could be some of the key strategies to address such barriers? And I think absolutely, there's not only are there often enabling environment barriers which can be enshrined in law, things around passports and land ownership, etc., but there are also the unwritten sociocultural norms, which we've already touched on a bit, and those do play a significant role. And I think it's often very difficult to even understand what's going on under the surface and why certain things are working and certain things aren't. This is, of course, why I think any international development organization or consultant, should, and I don't think this happens anymore, but it did in the past, but should not have the arrogance to go in and to think they can see what needs to be changed. We always have to work with strong local partners and organizations who understand the context. But we also have to be aware that we are all ingrained in our own society and culture, so that could also become very complex. So I see it very much as a dialogue, and this is why I very much appreciate the presentation that Siddiquee gave, because it shows, it's a process. It's a process within the organization. It's an internal process within the individual, and it's a process with the work that we do. And I don't think we even know ourselves individually what those social norms are or beliefs that are guiding us, and we do have to try and unpack that. And often I feel that programs are also resting on conventional wisdom about what women can and cannot do. So it's just received wisdom that, oh, well, women in our culture can't do X, Y, Z. But maybe the person who says that hasn't actually gone out into the field in their own country lately and refresh their knowledge of what's happening with women. Because all over the world we are seeing rapid change. The impact of the satellite dish up in the remote mountainous areas of Pakistan, and the access to Facebook in the Canadian Arctic, and you just see all over the world that young people have been exposed to other cultures, to other ways of doing things, to peers, and this is having an impact on social norms around the world. And I'm not saying for better or for worse. I'm just saying change is happening, and as we do our programs, we need to be aware of it. So, so key strategies to address such barriers, different approaches that have been used, of course, are gender sensitization and gender awareness, and those have been particularly successful where men and women have been engaged in dialogue, either separately or together. I remember in the Aga Khan Foundation up in some of these remote mountainous areas where change came very slowly, that men with the program themselves would go out to the communities, and even when it was about women's empowerment, they would sit and talk to men in the community about what was happening and why was it happening and could it be different. And it was a gentle approach. It wasn't a forced approach, but it was something that the project felt needed to happen in order for women to benefit as well. So there are different approaches. Some of that will be covered under the paper, and I know some of the BEAM research, which is upcoming, will also cover that. Siddiquee?
Okay, I have one more question on what are some practical steps to ensure that women empowerment strategies are incorporated at the design phase of the market system approach? We did talk a little bit about how project or programs actually can transform staff capacities. I think that itself is a very practical step to do, is a good investment to make. And then, of course, when we talk about key change levers, that what exactly that we want to change, and if they recognize the importance of these power relations in the communities we work. And also, the enabling environment piece there, which actually refers to challenging social norms and practices. I think those are very important because many of those shape the kind of progress, women would make after that initial investments of capacity building and, building on their agencies, etc. Just to give an example, like, in many countries of Africa, in terms of agricultural land, the worst land are actually given to, to the women. And if the local elites and the community heads and others, the way they exercise their powers and if they're not bring into the program as well, I think it's quite difficult to create that access because a piece of land is absolutely necessary for any farmer to actually gain, to make any kind of productivity gains. So there have been some successes from our programs, and once you're able to do this, I think there are significant changes that would offer, which actually can change the complete norms of or the attitudes of those men and other community leaders to women. And we often have heard them to say that, this is the greatest thing that had happened to these communities, and women are actually providing a lot of examples that how to do better agriculture when they're offered a good piece of land. So I would definitely look into those sort of perspectives when we talk about measurable outcomes and definitely the strategies into the design phase of the market system approach project. Linda.
Yeah, that's really interesting, Siddiquee, and we have a question here from Jody Thorpe, and I think it's kind of a follow-on question that came in this morning. And saying, some might assume that in order to achieve women's economic empowerment, that we have to start dealing with the agency issues first. So, decision-making, workload, confidence, leadership, and so on and so forth. But she said what I seem to be implying and what her experience is that you often start with access and the agency will follow. And that also seems to be what some of the other guidance is suggesting. And is there any good evidence on the relationship between agency and we, and what is the direction, how does the interaction work? And I think that word that Jody uses, interaction, is a very good word. I do think it's a bit of a chicken and egg question. I've seen areas where earlier work has been done on women's empowerment, and there have been results done in terms of gender sensitization and just creating awareness in communities, and that does make the job of it can make the job of a market systems program easier. I mean, if it's done well. Obviously, if it's not done well, then that can create problems. But because we're a market systems program and the objective of our programs are economic development, economic integration, it is more logical and I think more efficient and possibly more effective for us as market systems practitioners to begin with access. Now, in your context, you may find that, that is, as Siddiquee was suggesting, can be very wrapped up in agency issues and gender sensitization, and others not so. So I think you have to be very aware of your context and what the leverage points are. But I've seen many instances where women having better access to training, which may take agency issues into account, things like mobility and location and timing, where women have access to improved inputs or improved technologies, that as a result of those, women are empowered in their productive areas, and therefore agency empowerment can follow. But I also think over the long term, it's going to be an iterative process, that as women have increased access or agency, then it will have an impact on other aspects of access and agency, and that they can build, and indeed, I think in some cases, create a critical momentum for either individuals, households, communities, or even nations. So back to you, Siddiquee.
Okay, Linda, I do not have any questions, but I also see that time is up for the webinar, but if there are questions to our colleagues from WEAMS, I would like to hear them as well.
Siddiquee, there were a couple of questions in the chat box. I don't know if we can run over by a few minutes. I think WEAMS did say at some point we probably could go over a couple minutes. So maybe there is one here that I thought was quite relevant to the SDVC program, and that is about women's role. Like, do you think changes in women's role is a non-negotiable, or do you think it's or do you think that it's part of it, an important part of an empowerment, but not a necessary occurrence to consider empowerment to have been achieved? It's really about changes in women's roles, and I know that's something you've dealt with a lot in the dairy value chains in Bangladesh.
Absolutely. I think the kind of impacts we see from some, not all, but some of those untraditional roles that women have taken during the course of a program really made them a kind of a change agent into their families and communities. And that, of course, often has changes the way the social norms were used to be. For example, when we have recently also seen, some of those examples that many of our program participants have increased their productivity on a significant level. And therefore, this has bring a lot of benefits to the the family as a whole, and the mindset of the men and the other household members has also changed in terms of how they can support the women in terms of continuing her success in the dairy ventures. So transporting milk from the households, helping her in some of those household chores, different other, the mobility issues for women to go and collect their cashes from the collection centers. Many of those norms we have seen have changed over the period of time, and which is really inspiring.
Okay, thank you. Thank you, Siddiquee. So I think I noticed there's some people who have had to leave the discussion, and before more of you leave, I think it would be good just for us to wrap up and let you know where you can access these documents and so on. So, but first of all, thank you all so much for joining and for listening and for the questions that you've posed, and I just would love to sit down with each one of you and talk to you one-on-one and finish answering the questions we haven't answered. You've received in the chat box links to the resources related to this webinar, but those will also be available on the BEAM website, so please do look there. Also, unanswered questions will be grouped together and posted on the BEAM LinkedIn group, which Siddiquee and I can also look at it and engage in responses, but I hope you will also discuss with each other because there's such rich experience amongst the participants. In the chat box, I don't see it yet, but I believe there's going to be a link to a short survey on the webinar. It would be really fantastic to get your feedback. We always love to learn about ways that we can do things better. And finally, a plug, the BEAM conference coming up in Lusaka in May, there is going to be a couple of workshops the day before the two-day conference, and one of those workshops will be led by myself and a colleague at MEDA, and it will be on women's economic empowerment and market systems, a day-long workshop, and we will be covering in detail much of what you heard today, but also some other interesting things. So it would be great if some of you are there and able to participate. And when you sign up for the BEAM conference, which I hope many of you will do, you'll also have the opportunity to sign up for that additional workshop. So that's all for me. Siddiquee, did you have any final word?
Yeah, thanks for joining us, and we would like to hear more from you in terms of questions or comments on the framework and also some of the examples that we have presented. Thank you very much.